Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rinnie, and today we're getting mindful about grief. And I want to put out a big trigger warning right up front today because we are talking about grief within the context of losing both a parent and a child through miscarriage. So if any of those type of topics trigger you, please feel free to skip this episode. That's more than okay. But if you do stick around and it does impact you in some sort of way, please reach out to a mental health professional after this episode. And joining me for today's discussion, I've got Katie Rössler from Germany. How you going, Katie?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
No, I'm looking forward to having you. I was fortunate to be a guest on your podcast a little while back, so I'm grateful that you've decided to come on the Mindful Men podcast and share all your wisdom in terms of grief. So I'm really looking forward to this episode. We haven't talked about grief in depth on this show yet, so it's something that's going to be new and fresh for the audience, and I know you've got a lot of insights into it. But to introduce you to the audience, you're both a wife, you're a mum yourself, you're a couples therapist to high achievers who are ready to rebuild a stronger foundation for their relationship. So I can get a sense of relationship therapist as well.
Yes, very much so. And, grief work plays and intertwines and all of that pretty heavily.
I'm interested, before we get into the grief side of it, like what made you, I guess, pursue a career in as a therapist?
Well, I actually started college going into physics with the emphasis in pre-med because I was going to be a doctor. And then 6 months into that, I realized that the physics department weren't my people. I was too social. I was too like, guys, let's study and who's bringing food. And they were like, what is this? And so I was also taking like a general psych class and was like, oh, now these people, these people get me. They're interested. I grew up in a military family, moving every 2 to 3 years. So adapting, learning about people, understanding why we do what we do is like always part of my life. So as soon as I took classes like that, I was like, this is it. And I remember calling my mom and I was like, hey, Mom, I'm changing my major. And she's like, okay. And I was like, I'm going to go into psychology. She was like, okay. And she will tell you, if she was still here, she would say, yes, 100% could tell that she was supposed to be a counselor. Like therapist was like her calling. But in that moment, being told your daughter wasn't going to be a doctor, it was a moment of like, okay. And you're like, it's okay. I'm going to be a therapist. Like it'll all work out, Mom. In the end, I ended up doing marriage and family therapy as my training, 2 years of my master's and then 3 years residency. And I just loved it. And when you do a residency, just like a doctor, you're not always focused in one area. So I worked with teens and I worked with kids and all these different areas. But I knew that I loved working with couples. I loved sitting in the space of the tension that gets created. I know it sounds weird, but like, I'm comfortable. I'm okay with that, and going, hey, there's hope. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. Everything will be okay. So yeah, that's how it came about. It was supposed to be that I was going to be a dermatologist. And then it became, I'm going to be a therapist. And everybody just had to get on board with that.
I've talked to a few people that have lives in the military, but they've been serving members. So what was it like as a child in a family that moved around a lot?
Great question. It's actually something I bring up in my book, The New Face of Grief, because what helped me understand that I had experienced grief throughout my life was reflecting on moving every 2 to 3 years and going, I've had to grieve dreams and visions for like next year we'll get to go do this all together, right? With your friends in high school, and then you're moving and you don't get to do that. So as a kid, it was hard to constantly pick up and go, and things are in boxes and they're constantly change and transition. Now I look back and see the value in it. I also see the challenges. I mean, we've been here in Germany for almost 8 years, and I do get antsy and I do get a little frustrated. Like, can we move the furniture? Can we paint the walls? Like, I need something new. Let's go on vacation, just something. There is that piece where I see how it helped me to be adaptable, to be comfortable with change, to be comfortable with new cultures, and not feel like, well, it's my way or it has to be this way, or I'm much more open. And I think that was from being in a military family. But I will say it's very interesting having the decision of where you're going to live constantly be chosen for you. Right. And so then when you as an adult get to go like, where do I want to live? What house do I want to be in? You kind of blink and go like, well, I can go anywhere. It's like going out to eat, right? Like I know where I want to eat, but if it comes to where I'm going to live, I'm like, I'll make any place a home. I'm good. And so there's this challenge of like, it was always chosen for me, except for college, and college was fun. But, then you're like, okay, now what? Who's going to decide for me?
It's interesting you brought up like grieving, having to move and missing out on things that you had looked forward to, because when I think of grief, I just think of a loss of somebody. And I've been reflecting on my own mental health journey over the 35 plus years. And as I get older, I'm learning that maybe I have been grieving this lost sense of a childhood or a teenage years or even an early adult years without mental illness, because I've always been in that mental illness trap. So I'm interested in your thoughts about what grief actually is. Like, how would you define it as a therapist? Like, what does it look like? What does it feel like for anybody who doesn't feel like they've ever experienced grief?
Well, I can say without a doubt, we've all experienced grief. We've all felt grief. We have just only seen it as mourning, the sadness and the loss of a person. Grief, I believe, is letting go of the way we thought life would or should go. So it's kind of mini deaths, right? Like this didn't happen the way I thought it would, or you were supposed to live forever, or this was supposed to be this way. So when we think of like a death of someone, even though logically we might see they have cancer or they're getting older, right? Like we know logically, there's still that little kid in us that's like, they're supposed to be here forever. You're supposed to be there for my wedding. You're supposed to be there for my first kids. You're supposed to be there for this. And so we struggle with that. And so that's that grief process. But you can grieve moving. You can grieve because of health or mental health issues and the life that, quote, you should have or could have had. You can grieve when dreams don't come to fruition. As a parent, you can grieve choices your child makes. I find grief with empty nest, all the kids are out and then you're left with, who am I? What's my identity? I know when I became a parent, I reflect back and there was a lot of grief. Like, wow, my freedoms are taken. And, now me and my husband have some interesting interactions and like things aren't the same. This is not how this is supposed to be. So when it comes to grief, it's just, if you can look at it from the framework of letting go of what you thought life would or should go, and that sort of uncomfortability, and it may come out as frustration and irritation and anger that kind of just sat with you for a while, undercurrent there, like ants under the skin, like I'm here, but I don't know what you feel, and maybe it's sadness or fear. That was grief. And the more we're able to acknowledge it and be like, I'm just really like grieving that this didn't happen, and grief shows up in a variety of ways, then it's like, it really is like muscle tension that just releases. And like the body's like, thank you. You've identified it. Now you're going to do something about it. And your listeners will be happy to hear that most of the time when I do grief work with couples or individuals, the first thing I ask them is, what are your anger outlets? Because that's probably how grief is showing up, because that's socially appropriate. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, like, control, right? So it's like, what are you doing to release that? What are the outlets? And when I say anger outlets, people usually get that, like I'm punching something, I'm running, I'm, breaking something. But I'm also like, what are you creating? Think about great music and art, usually created out of anger, right? And a passion for something, standing up for justice, usually out of anger. So it's two sides of the coin. So that's why I say we've all experienced grief. We just didn't understand it as such, and is probably why it held on as baggage with us as we went about life.
So I was going to ask you, is there hidden type of grief? But I think it's pretty obvious that there is hidden grief. How do we, like you mentioned that, tuning into how our body's going, our brain's going. Maybe, I guess, your work as a therapist can help you kind of identify grief as well?
Yeah. So what I usually do, and the listeners can do this, I mean, you sit down and create a timeline of your life and all the major events that happen and minor events, getting bullied in the schoolyard, right? Or that one time that people made fun of you because of whatever, that still kind of has a little tinge to it. Like, oh, I can still remember how that felt. Maybe some tears in my eyes, or I feel angry, or I get passionate about it. Those need to go on your timeline. And what I find with my clients is that there's a theme, usually a sense of like a loss of freedom, loss of my voice, feeling abandoned. There's something that kind of is replaying in all of the storyline that helps you go. It's kind of like watching your own movie, like, this is something I need to work on. And so you don't have to grieve every single individual thing. You can grieve a sense of, I always felt abandoned. And so how do we then not keep replaying that belief, and I'm always going to be abandoned. That's just how my life is in the present day and in your future. So it's looking at a timeline, and absolutely, it's called hidden grief. In the therapy world, they call it disenfranchised grief. That just sounds too up here. I like to bring it down to it's hidden. It's the stuff that people go, well, nobody died, so why are you having problems with it? And you're like, because I am. Deal with it. It's just how it is. But that timeline will help you see, these are some of the things that still stick with me, that I stay up at night replaying in my head, or somebody says something and I blow up to here like a volcano. And I'm like, why did I get so upset? It reminds me of this time and this time and this time. So, yeah.
I'm glad you brought up like the little things. It's not just the big things, it's also the little things. Because in my therapy clinic, I'm also talking to guys about the little things as well. It's not just these big things. And we talk about trauma a lot. So having a traumatic event, which could be the loss of a loved one, or it could be a big car accident. But it also could be, as you said, someone saying something in the schoolyard way back when, which is what happened to me, that triggered something in you which fundamentally changed your life or something like that, but you haven't really tuned into that. You just thought it was a little moment in time, but it's actually quite a big moment in time. And I find a lot of the guys that I work with, and a lot of people in general, they avoid mental health support or therapy support or relationship support because they feel like their situation isn't big enough compared to somebody else.
Yep.
What do you say to people coming in and who might have something little that they're not really wanting to explore, but it's actually something big? How do you help them through that?
Yeah. And I think when we compare, we can always talk ourselves out of getting support, because especially in today's world, it's very easy on the news and everywhere to see something way worse than anything that we've experienced and go, okay, well, I can deal with it myself. I'll figure it out myself. But what I often say to people is we forget that not only is it the experience that happened, but the meaning that we put behind it, our personality, our temperament, our own, family genetic line, right? Epigenetics, like there's stuff that's traveled down. And so we're more inclined to react to certain events that happen in our life and see them as traumatic. Whereas another kid standing right next to you, bullied in the same way, might have been like, whatever, and able to just let it roll off. But you're like this perfect smoothie mixed of all these different things, so that thing that was said or what was done to you activated something in you of like, there's something wrong with me. There's something about me, right? Like it just kicked that up. So you can't compare because everybody's a different smoothie. Everybody has different components to them that they bring to the table they're not even fully aware of as a kid or a teen, or heck, some of us as adults are not, that you have to go, I just really can't compare, because either way, apples, oranges is still fruit. I can go get support. Like, it's okay. But I would say most of the time, if we're comparing and talking ourselves out of it, it's a fear of what is that person going to make me think or do, or what am I going to have to feel? And it isn't about comparing for the sense of like, oh, I shouldn't. It's, I don't really want to do this. So let me think of a reason why not to.
I guess within the context of a couples therapy as well, like you have maybe one partner, I'm going to say, male, female, just to start off with, but I guess it would be interesting to see if you work with same-sex couples as well. Like, is there a way that a male compared to a female expresses grief in your sessions?
Ooh, wonderful question. So one thing that I usually try to identify first is who's more of the thinker than the feeler, because it doesn't really matter on gender with that. But let's say we go stereotypical, right? conditioned guy to not be the feeler, to be more the thinker, logical, practical. His grief is when he starts to over-explain and use way too many words to talk about something. Like, well, my parents did this, but like I see and I understand why they did this because they were just trying to help me, and you're like, you just don't want to feel it. Whereas for a female who's conditioned to be okay with emotionally expressing herself, you've got the tears. I mean, I've even had women replay scenarios and like feel the anger and hit down on the table, and you're like, ooh, you were there again, right? Because you're visioning it happening again. So I would say those are the two ways that I see it play out. I will even say to the man, so really you've got grief around this, that even though you're able to explain why your parents did this or why this was like this, there's a sense of impact on your life. And there's usually a little bit of a sit back. And when we're talking about grief, like let's say it's because of death, a loss of a family member, loss of a friend or something like that, it's not manipulative in what I'm trying to do, but I usually ask, what is the legacy piece you want to leave? Because there's something about men and women, but really men, that's like, what is my legacy? What am I leaving? And so when I ask, this person who's no longer here, how are you going to continue their legacy? That starts to hit at the core of some emotions. And I find that for men is when that's when they start to show, because it means being creative and thinking about how much that person mattered to them. And I think that's the same when it comes to, any losses that we have as a couple, that when we start to touch into what are we going to learn from this? What are we going to do with this? How are we going to, what legacy will this leave? You have to feel it. You have to go well, how much has this impacted me? Then I know how much legacy to give to it.
It's interesting how you're saying how, once they hit the core for guys, the perception even of being in that therapy space changes almost. You hit them to the core and they're like, okay, we can go a little bit deeper here. I'm not used to going deeper, but we can go a little bit deeper. And it's quite a beautiful thing. I do that with values. And when we're talking about values with the guys that I work with, so what are your core values? What kind of man do you actually want to be, as opposed to the one that you've kind of been just living on autopilot or conditioned as well? It's quite a powerful thing. So I'm interested now, we've talked a bit about what grief is, and you've got some very personal experiences that I think are relatable to a lot of people in our community. It's the loss of a parent. We've got an aging population here in Australia, so there's more and more people going into aged care kind of homes or the aged care system. So I'd like to start there. And so it's 2018, just to set the scene, and you received a phone call about your mum. Can you talk us through that experience?
Yeah. So middle of the night here, my family's based in the United States, and it was my brother on the phone. He was on the flight going to do the Chicago Marathon, and had gotten the call when he was stopped in one of the cities getting on the next plane that they had found my mom dead in her home. And it was a big shock at 2:00 in the morning to get that call. And just one of those moments where when you replay it, you feel the emptiness and just the drop, when you've got bad news and you just feel this drop. And so going through that experience of having a parent who lives in your homeland and you live abroad, it was unexpected. She was 57 years old. There was nothing like, hey, we've got some problems, be aware. She just didn't wake up. It really rocked all of us, but especially me as a mom of 2 young kids at the time. Because what I realized was the holder of my life story, the holder of what was I like as a kid, the holder of, is this normal, was gone, because my dad, military, he was gone all the time. So I had not thought about that until months into her loss, when I was like, I wonder if I was like this. I wonder if this was normal. I didn't have that piece. And not only did I have the loss of a parent figure, but I had the loss of my memories, because there are memories I will, of course, not have, and that my aunt or my grandmother won't have either, because she only held them. And she was one of those who could drive somewhere once and remember how to get there the rest of her life. And so she just had so many memories. And I felt like my compass was spinning, this was somebody I spoke to on a regular basis. My mom, I was so close to her. Even living abroad, we talked often. And, when that cutoff happened so fast, without preparation or with preparation, it is a big hole in you. And the following year, so that was October 2018, the following year, we already knew we were wanting to get pregnant. It wasn't like, let's purposely try right now, but it was like, we're still trying based off of our kids' ages. We'd like it to happen ideally around now. And we got pregnant in the early summer that following year. And it was just like, oh gosh, this is like a blessing. This is wonderful. Yay. Like something happy out of all of this, right? And I had decided to fly to the States to be with my family around her birthday time. And in that process, after arriving, I ended up losing that baby and having a miscarriage. And we were 9 weeks along then. Heartbeat had been seen. And it was just like, like when you stand up at the ocean and the wave just keeps hitting you every time you stand back up. It was that. And it was just this like, why? Why me? Why is this happening to me? Like, what is this about? Like, what is this quote punishment, right? Like I was in that victim stage for a long time with that. And I did a lot of inner work during that time, a lot of my own reconciling life. What is life? What does this look like? And grief process, right? And funnily enough, like as much as I was sort of grieving that time, it wasn't until 2020 that I really was like, now I'm doing the grief work. But then that following December, we were pregnant again. We were 6 weeks along. And on Christmas Day here is Christmas Eve everywhere else. So the 24th, I lost the baby. And that was just another big hit. And for a really long time, I was actually washing the dishes when it happened. And I hated on Christmas Day to wash dishes because it was just replaying this feeling and this thought and these emotions all over again. My experience of loss after loss after loss, a parent, and then babies, and still having 2 kids was a very interesting process because, you get people saying, well, oh, good thing you've got 2 already, or, oh, well, your mom's there to watch over those little angels. And you're just like, who comes up with this shit? Like, who thinks this is okay to say? And people will say all sorts of things to make themselves feel better often than you or what they think you want to hear. And that process led me on like, I need to just grieve. I need to just grieve and figure all this out. And it was really during the lockdown that I was like, okay, let me start journaling and writing this out and figuring this out. And I had read some of it to a friend and she's like, this is a book. So you let me know when you're ready. I was like, well, I'm still in the heart of all of it. And in that time, we got pregnant with our 3rd. So COVID baby, lockdown, relaxed, not having to rush from here to there. Like we're just hanging out at home all the time. So it was very easy pregnancy, but with miscarriage, you always have that fear the whole pregnancy that something will happen. And a book came out of that. And I started creating grief programs and different things for people a year or 2 later from that, because obviously I didn't want to be in my own wounding and then like, let me teach you while I'm going to burst into tears, deal with my stuff. But like, let me really work on this. Yeah. And so the losses completely rocked my world, totally changed who I am, completely shifted my identity. And I can say now in the best ways possible, and anybody who's in the thick of it right now, you're probably rolling your eyes. It's okay. I walked through those fires and now carry buckets of water for people. I'm not going to walk through the fire for you. I'm not going to even walk beside you, but I've got buckets of water of tools and ideas and ways to think about life that will help cool the process for you because you still have to walk through it. And I think that is the biggest lesson I learned was you can still celebrate all of life, all of it, and walk through the most horrible experiences and coexist in those spaces, which is really hard for most of us to do because we're not taught that.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. That's quite a profound, as you said, waves of grief and loss over and over again. I was interested, like in the moment when you're, say, we'll start with your mum, like when she passed, how did you navigate? Like, were you still working? Like, how did you function on a day-to-day with that immense loss of your mum?
Yeah. So in the beginning, I took a couple months off from work. I actually was also doing like online courses and let me launch this and these things. And it was like, nope, let's stop everything. Funnily enough, that year I had decided I was going to run 1,000 kilometers. And I was with a group of runners and we all had our own goals. And that was the one thing in that year that I stuck with and was determined to finish and see all the way through. And I bawled my eyes out when I hit that because I could have given up, could have just been like, bad year, not doing this. But I stopped running for a long time after that because it was too entwined with the emotion of the grief. Part of what's important for me to function is to keep a little bit of normal life. So there was a point where I went back to work. There was a point where like that actually was soothing. And then I'd have the evenings to, to cry. Or when you've got 2 young kids, you've got daycare for a period of time. I would also use that time for I would listen to music and just stomp and like rage and be angry. And I had to use the time that I had wisely. And I also needed some normalcy. And so that was the balance. And my husband was really amazing about planning a trip for us as like a family vacation to go away somewhere we'd never been, just away from everything, by water, because I'm such a water baby. And it was exactly what I needed, just a soothing place where the kids are entertained and I could just sit there. Because something about grief, when you're really heavy in grief, is like you can just blank stare at anything for a really long time and not think, not even feel really. You're just there. It's like the most powerful mindful practice, right? Like grief is like, you're actually present. You're not worried about anything else. You're just there. You just exist. I sometimes miss that state because life gets so busy and your mind keeps going that I'd say that was one of the most influential experiences of grief where I was like, wow, I just blank. It's like amazing. I would love to have this on a regular basis, but not because of grief, not because of loss. So I had to adapt to what my old life had looked like. But that's why it took so many years, I think, is because I tried to keep some form of normalcy, which I think in today's world, you have to, right? They still have bills to pay. You got to take care of the kids. You can't, some of us will end up staying in bed for weeks, months. I didn't give myself that opportunity. I didn't give myself that permission.
And did you notice any grieving from the rest of your family? Like you mentioned a brother before, your dad, like how did they navigate through that as a family unit?
So my parents weren't together. And so his grief is quite different. And that's a very, actually quite private topic for him. So I'll leave that one alone. My brother, runner, period. that was it, run. Yeah, for my family, because it was such a shock, her sister, her brother, her parents are still alive. It was just an emptiness feeling. And we all came together by talking as regularly as we could and just checking in. But there were times where I needed to pull away. And I think that's a very normal thing in any form of grief, hidden grief, death grief, whatever you want to call it, anticipatory grief, is we got to get on our little boat and go off to our own island and have solitude. But we have to be very careful that time on that island doesn't become isolation. And it's a mind game, right? Like I need some time away and I need to be on my own. And the longer we're there and people stop checking in and people stop caring, quotations, but they're being respectful of our solitude, it feels like they don't care. Nobody matters. I'm isolated. I'm alone. So it's this double-edged sword. You have to be really, really careful how you go along that. But there would be times where I would pull away and they were quite respectful of that. I think I was always that way. And then I'd come back and kind of reunite and engage. And it was wonderful to come together on like birthdays or, even on the anniversary of her death and go like, let's go out to dinner or let's do something special. I take my girls for ice cream on her birthday because I know she would have done that. And it's just our tradition and they know, oh, it's grandma's birthday. We get ice cream. Like we get ice cream, right? And my oldest is the only one who, I don't know if she actually has memories anymore, but can tell you, I remember this and I remember that. But, we talk about her so much that I'm sure some of those memories are because we've talked about it. Like, and she did this. But for my middle daughter, she has no memories. Even the pictures we have, she, of course, doesn't remember. She was 2. And then my youngest, who's 3, We'll never have a memory of her. We'll only have the stories we share and the ice cream we get, the legacy piece, right? The things that we'll instill in her because of my mom. So our grief as a family was quite unique to how we handle and deal with things, but also there's the celebration of her life. And that was always a part of my family. Now, when it comes to my husband, I think his process, he's German, so we have different cultural piece to American grief, or how I was, and how he was. And thankfully, he loves to talk about her. He loves to say she would have loved this. And I think that is a piece that's quite healing for him to continue to say those things and talk about her versus to just, oh, well, let's not talk about that. It's uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about that. Like, he's good about that.
For people living from Germany, is it something that they openly talk about? Is this like a taboo topic?
Oh, they don't talk about it. No. Right? It's very, you hold in your feelings. Yeah. And this is not all Germans, right? This is a very general, but every culture kind of has their way. And I think with the German culture, it's very logical. I mean, they're very intelligent people and they're very structured and it's how things got the way they were, right? Like we'll go this and excel in cars and rockets and all these things. But emotions are sort of this why are you showing that? And you're like, okay, well, and friendliness, things like this openness that tends to not be there. I mean, that's my husband and I like to joke. That's why so many Germans like to go to the States and everybody's so nice and friendly. And you're like, yeah. So for him, I think being with me helped him to have the space to open up, whereas it may not have been that way differently. And I think also his grandfather died when his dad was about the same age as I was when I lost my parents. So I think for him, it was also I've seen this grief before, as the child of it kind of thing, and very open to having the conversations and talking about it.
So that was the experience with your mum, but I'm interested to hear now how you navigated through, the two miscarriages, because it's a very different thing compared, you're a mum and a parent, and so now it's your child. How did you navigate through that?
Yeah. For me, I really turned to the spiritual. I would see dragonflies and really believe that was a sign of, one of the babies coming to say, I'm okay and everything's okay. And for my husband, it's not that was uncomfortable. It's just not the way he copes or deals with things. So it was kind of like, okay, sweetie, sure. We never got into places where it would be fighting about it. And I think that's because I was a therapist and had worked with people who'd gone through this, that I knew that first of all, the baby wasn't inside of him. So there wasn't the immediate attachment. There wasn't the immediate positive and I'm dreaming of all the things, what this is going to be like, what the room's going to be like. I've got the Pinterest board, everything. He's not doing that. He always wanted to be a dad. So there was always excitement about it. There was no hesitation, he will tell you, since I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be a dad one day. So that's a passion for him, but it's a different attachment. And logically and emotionally, I could understand that from the beginning. I think the hardest parts for me were the traumatic experience of losing and having the miscarriage, losing the baby, the physical effects. And the physical effects aren't just one day and not the next day, it's weeks and sometimes months. And that piece, how would he know that? How would he understand it even, right? It's like me saying, you should get my menstrual cycle, all, 27 to 30 days of it, right? No, you're gonna be I have no clue. I will never understand this. That's okay. So for me, it was hard to kind of at times feel like if he'd had a really good day and he'd come home and I'm I'm still suffering and struggling. It's how do I don't want to ruin his happiness, but I also feel really pissed off that he's not having to deal with this too, right? We both created this child. So there would be that tension and that frustration, but that was the importance of me having my own coach or therapist or spiritual mentor. I kind of had a mixture at the time of support for me to be able to be this is happening and I'm angry and I'm upset and I don't understand it. I know one thing that really helped my husband, and I highly, highly recommend this to men, is to talk about it with your friends, because more than likely they've not told you they've lost babies too. And even if some of them go, oh man, we haven't had that experience, I don't know what to say, one or two somewhere down the pipeline are going to be like, I do. Or they'll say, I know someone who has, let me get you in touch. And just talking to them and hearing, yeah, I'm just here, I'll just listen, right? Or here are some things that you might want to be aware of that your wife might go through. That is super, super powerful. But I will tell you that a majority of the couple sessions I've had in the last 15 years, a topic that comes up from the past is a miscarriage or infertility that was never really talked about, that was never really emotionally dealt with because of resentment and frustration and holding grudges and the whys. Why didn't you feel the same way I did? Why didn't you care the same way I did? And it is my responsibility to help them navigate it in the present moment, even if it was 8, 10, 15 years later. So if you're going through this right now, if you're in a space where like something has happened or has happened in the recent, present day, in the last 3 to 5 years even, talk about it. You talking about it doesn't make her feel worse. Unless she goes, you made me feel worse. And it's like, okay, well then you don't really want to, she's not processing her grief. That's a sign like, well, maybe we should go to a coach or a therapist and talk. But if she can go, oh my God, I wondered when you were finally going to talk about this. Like that is so soothing to our soul to have our partner bring the topic up in a, how are you? Here's how I'm feeling. Here's what I'm thinking way. Because sure as heck, that woman probably knows when that first birthday would have been. Even with the other kids that have been born in my life, I'm aware around, oh God, what it would have been like to have 5 kids. Right? Like, thank you that didn't happen, but like, whoa, right? 3 is enough. I'm going crazy, but I wouldn't have had our youngest. Like, so that's powerful. I can logically think about that, but like, wow, what would those personalities have been like? We have 3 girls. Would it have been a boy? Would there have been a boy in the mix? There's a lot of things. And I don't know if he thinks about those things. And I'm actually okay with that because that's, if he wants to, he can. But I can talk to him about it. I know that. We've done a lot of work in our relationship to be able to have conversations. The poor man is married to a therapist, right? Like there's going to be like, we're going to talk about this whether you like it or not. And sometimes it's him going, we're going to talk about this whether you like it or not. I'm like, oh, it backfires. Like it comes back to get me. So for us, navigating it was just me in my corner, him in his corner, us coming together when we needed to, and just respecting the different ways that we dealt with it. But talking to people, me talking to other women and hearing that almost half of my friends had miscarriages and never told me before that. Like, I don't know why we don't talk about it. It's actually like almost 1 in 3 now that we have this super early test results, right? And why that is, I had an amazing German doctor. Okay, you're going to enjoy this. This is a German doctor, male doctor. He's like, actually, getting pregnant is a miracle. Not losing the baby. That's like actually the norm. And I was like, what? And he's like, think about if you've got Microsoft Word on your computer and your husband has Microsoft Word on his, and we cut the program down the middle, all the coding and everything and on both sides, and then you bring them together in a new computer and you say, I hope it fits perfectly and functions well. What's the likelihood? That's the miracle of birth. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, I get what you're doing, but I also feel things. But it made it make sense. It actually made it go like, oh, because I just see all these people getting pregnant and teens getting pregnant and all these things happening. So it seems like something's in the water. And it's like, actually, if you look at scientifically, biologically, it makes sense that is an actual miracle that everything lines up correctly, genetically, and everything. Okay, so it's actually normal to have the miscarriage? So the shame I feel has nothing to do with the miscarriage. It has everything to do about the cultural programming, what has been around me, the stuff we didn't talk about, that people, other women, other men felt shame about and guilt about, so they didn't say anything. So now I'm the generation that's like, I still feel awful about it. But now social media, we're like, guess what? Let's talk about this. We're doing, we're bringing our talk about it on podcasts, right? We are the generation that can say, hey, let's start to bring things into the light. And as Brene Brown talks about vulnerability and leadership, like you got to start somewhere. And if this is the topic that you feel called to, if you've experienced it and you're like, you know what, maybe I should start talking about it, just do it. And it's simple. Like you and I being like, so this, when we had our first miscarriage and just me and bringing it into conversation, or, it was a couple years ago. When was that? Yeah, around the first time we had a miscarriage and I'm not even talking about the miscarriage. I'm talking about something else, but I've intertwined that this is a normal part of the timeline way I think. Then you could be like, oh God, we had a miscarriage too. Wait, when was yours? Around the same time? Why weren't we talking? Yeah, shame and a feeling of something's wrong with us. And we're alone and nobody else has gone through this. Reach out, openly talk. You will find you are really actually not alone.
You touched on so many things that I wanted to unpack there, but I wanted to let you express it as well, because it's so important just to express once you get started. And we were talking off air, like, this is a topic I've never spoken about, and I've made sure my wife was okay me sharing this. And so this is the world premiere of my miscarriage story and my wife's miscarriage story. But it was 8 years ago, and my wife felt pregnant, and I remember she was actually away for work, and she was at some meetings all day, and she had no female friends around her. It was all male colleagues and stuff like that. And I remember her calling me from the bathroom during a break between meetings and say, I've just had a miscarriage. And explaining the physical elements of it and the emotional and the mental. And I couldn't be there to soothe her. Could only be on the phone, and my heart sank, and I didn't know what to say or didn't know what to do. I felt helpless, totally helpless. I know my wife, she rang her mum afterwards and got some soothing support from her mum, but it was me constantly checking in the rest of that day, and I couldn't get to her because she was in another meeting and another meeting. So she had to put that mask back on, walking out of that toilet, to say that she's okay, she's tough, not show signs of pain or grief or sorrow or hurt or anything like that, because she wasn't like that as well. She didn't want to walk into a meeting at this all-day work thing and start bawling her eyes out. So she buried it. And we talked about it when she got back, but it's something that I've never really spoken about, because I didn't know because I'm a guy, I was even allowed to talk about it, because it wasn't something that, as you were saying, I didn't physically go through it. My wife did. And from what she explained was horrific and it's terrible. But for me, it was a bit of am I allowed to talk about it? Should I be talking about it? Is this my place to talk about it? Because I didn't physically go through it. So I'm glad that you shared that guys should talk about this and we can normalize it. And it is actually quite a common thing. I was looking at, you said 1 in 3, and I was looking at our data here in Australia last night, and it was like between 1 to 4, 1 to 5, depending on where the data's from. But often in the commentary, it would say this number's probably a lot higher, because a lot of the mums, they don't actually realize they've had a miscarriage.
Right.
And so that number could be a lot higher. It could be 1 in 3, 1 in 2. It could be, and I think we've heard the similar story that it's actually a miracle to get pregnant in the first place. And I would probably liken it to Microsoft and Apple coming together because they're on totally different wavelengths and so forth. But I'm so glad you said to share it, and it is such an important thing. And this is why I get such diverse people on my podcast to share their life stories, because it opens up these windows to things that a lot of guys find taboo to talk about. They struggle to talk about it. And even me talking about this miscarriage bring up a whole lot of emotions that I haven't felt in a long time, because I haven't talked about it with therapists, friends. I haven't even told my family. So if they're listening to this is going to be the first time that they've heard about it. My wife has since told me that she's told all her family, and I think a couple of her friends as well, and she's been processing it for years probably. But I've held on to that like a little tight box as well, and it's something that I've locked away. So this is why I wanted you to come on the show, to hear your side, hear the female side of miscarriages, but also the loss of a parent as well. Because I haven't experienced that. I've only experienced loss of a grandparent. And so for me, my family is very nuclear, it's very small, and so I'm yet to experience that. But I know my mum, she lost her daughter, so I lost a sister after she was several days old. So grief has been in my family, but it's not something we even talk about it either. So talking about it is certainly huge and important. And that's, I guess, where someone like you as a therapist can help. How do you navigate the lived and the learned experience in this space now that you're a lived experience therapist with grief that is very real and very raw? Do you feel like it improves your ability to connect with people that walk into your clinic and you're able to better serve them now?
Really good question. I first want to just hold space for the fact that you just really just shared something very authentic and vulnerable without doing therapist mode on you. And let's just honor the fact that you finally got to talk, right? The secret got to come out. Like that felt like a secret. You felt like you were holding on for her and you get to talk about it. Now she's already been like, I've been talking about forever, but you get to finally like, oh, okay. Now you get to talk about it and how freeing that's going to be from here on out. There'll be episodes you probably weave it in. It's going to get be shared. And I think that's beautiful. So thank you. I just want to hold that space because you're really good at being like, now let's go back to professional mode. Good. But can we all cheer? I hope you're listening and cheering him on going, yeah, like you did it. Like sometimes that feels overwhelming to even get to the point where you can vulnerably share something, like you said, that you've held on so tightly in the little box. So thank you for letting me be the person to sit beside you. I know we're not literally beside each other, but it feels that way on this to have that discussion. Your question about living it, does it help me sit with someone? I would reflect that back to you. Living what you had, even though you held it in the secret, were you able to sit with men in a more powerful way because you know what it feels like to feel helpless when your partner's going through something and when you can't really do anything to fix it, and we'll never be able to fix that, right? Like, God love men. You guys love to fix things for us, and we get it. Rescuers, knight in shining armor. But we have to, again, walk through the fire. We have to. We become better wives from it, just like you guys become better husbands from walking through your fire and actually growing from it. So I do believe that going through so many life experiences, I can sit in the uncomfortable argument with a couple and be like, this is nothing, right? Like, no, it is big, but it's like, I've worked with teens at a locked facility who have attacked each other, who have called me all sorts of names. Like, it helps you have perspective and to be able to hold hope for people because you know you got through it and you know you might be special, but you're not anything different than the specialness they have in them. And I think that's the piece that helps when you do the work and you've healed as much as you can up until now, right? Where we're always healing, you just sit differently with people. It's much calmer, right? You know, like I probably would have just moved on and answered your question, but I was like, no, I have been where you are and had that first episode where I shared it and it is raw. So we have to walk some of the things that other people are going to go through around us so that we can actually sit with them. And you and your wife and me and my husband, we don't know why those miscarriages happened, but I think about, I have 3 girls. What are the chances they're going to have one? And then I'm going to be able to sit with them and talk to them about it, right? And not say stupid things to try to soothe them or make them feel better and just sit with them. Yeah. And that empowers me that legacy of these little babies is going to be the support that their sisters will need one day.
It's such a powerful, and you probably will sit with them and say something stupid because you're human as well.
Inevitable.
So I'm interested if people are like, they're liking the sound of what you can do and support them. Can you plug the business that you've got, the therapy clinic, and also the podcast as well? Because it is such a valuable podcast. It shares so many deep and meaningful conversations. I'd love for you to share that with the world and hopefully gain a few more, people calling your clinic or listening into the podcast as well.
Yeah. So for couples, the work that I do right now is called the Rebuild program. And it's actually perfect for couples who've gone through things like this. It's that experiences that we've had that have broken the foundation of our relationship or cracked it or really affected us. And I like to say it's time to tear it all down and rebuild. And we all actually need to do this every 7 to 10 years because we're different people. So the Rebuild program you can find on my website, katierössler.com, or find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, wherever you are. Connect with me and say rebuild, right? Rebuild. And I'll send you all over the information on it. If you want to work specifically on grief, just write me as well and just say grief. And then I'll share with you how I do that work too. I work with clients all around the world online. And those who are here in Munich, Germany get to sit in my presence and I get to sit in theirs. And it is awkward now post-COVID to be like, oh, we get to see each other again? This just feels weird, right? Like I can't sit funny when you don't know that I'm sitting funny or I've got my shoes off or like, no, you can see everything I'm doing. Okay. So it changes the dynamic. But yeah, so that's how people can work with me. And the podcast is called The Balance Code. And it's really about how we can start to find better balance in our lives, see rest as productive, learn self-care tools that don't feel like ridiculous and actually help, and really better understand ourselves and our pasts that are impacting our need to like do, have more, go more, and start to calm that down.
Yeah, love it. And I was a guest on the Balance Code, and it was a great time to meet you and talk about men's mental health and continue this conversation. I think, as you said before, I'm going to start adding in this miscarriage story into my mental health discussions because it's something that I have left out on purpose. And sometimes I've actually forgotten about it, but it's nice to have these conversations to remind myself, hey, there's more to my timeline than I'm giving credit to as well.
Yeah, please do.
So, Katie, thanks so much for coming on. There is one last question I'll ask, and we do talk about some pretty big topics on the show. Some can be really triggering. And for anyone who's still listening and they're feeling a bit upset or it's affecting them, please, as I said before, reach out to someone who can support you, whether it's a therapist, a doctor, a good friend, or a family member. It's really important. But we like to leave it on a lighter note. And I like for you to plug something that's making you feel good at the moment. And that could be what you're watching on TV. It could be what you're reading, a self-care activity. It could be a podcast. It could be absolutely anything you like. Just plug something that makes you feel good.
Yeah, something that's making me really excited and feel good right now is I'm about to take something off my bucket list of a place that I want to visit in about 2 weeks' time. We're going to go to Savannah, Georgia. I'm military kid, but always grew up in the southern area of the United States, different states everywhere. And I never got to go to Savannah, Georgia. So we're doing that and we're doing 2 full days there. And I'm like a little kid at a candy store, super excited about it. So that keeps me like super bubbly right now.
And you've got to fly are you going with the whole family, like across the world to go to Savannah, Georgia?
Well, not just for that. It's a 2-week vacation to visit family for Easter, and okay. We have 2 extra days at the end. And I was like, well, it's just right here. Let's go. And my husband's like, bucket list item, doing it. We're very adventurous. We love to travel. So, and yes, we travel with 3 little kids a lot. So they're used to it.
You'd put your therapist hat on there in those conversations, in those airplanes and airports. It must be pretty taxing.
You don't tell people what you do when you're a therapist on an airplane. You just don't. I learned the hard way. 3 hours later, and you're like, why did I tell them? Why did I tell them?
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Katie, so much. It's really been a pleasure to sit with you again and have a good chat. I love our conversations. So thanks so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. And I appreciate, again, you letting me sit with you as you shared your story.
Thank you. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.